Yeah. So how many of you have listened to the Front End Happy Hour podcast? Great. So some of the familiar listeners, great to see. What we do is we talk about front end while drinking. So a series of topics, and we all sit around and have drinks. So that's what we're going to do on stage. Today what we decided for Reactathon, we obviously want to talk about Angular, right? That makes sense. No, we're obviously talking about React. We figured we'd talk about React at scale. Before we get started, I'd like to go around and give introductions of today's panelists. Jem, you want to give an introduction yourself?
Hi, Jem Young. I'm a senior software engineer at Netflix.
I'm Stacy London. I'm a front-end engineer at Atlassian working on Bitbucket Cloud.
I'm Derrick Showers. I am a senior software engineer at LinkedIn.
And I'm Ryan Burgess. I'm a software engineering manager at Netflix. In each episode of the podcast, we actually choose a keyword that if it's mentioned at all in the podcast, we will all take a drink. So on stage, we're going to do the same thing. And actually, Ben's going to even play a little bit of a noise for us if we get it. Yeah. So he's going to keep us honest. So if we hear that, we definitely have to drink. So what did we decide today's keyword is?
Structure.
All right, so if you hear the word structure and that ding, we are all drinking. All right, so let's get started. I'm interested to know, before we even get into React, what does scale mean to each of you?
I mean, for me, I guess it's a lot of things, right? From a people perspective, scale to me really just means like there's more than one dev working on the app. At that point, you're immediately scaling. You're immediately having to think of somebody else working on your code, and that always has implications.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's beyond. I think it's more than just the amount of users and traffic we were talking earlier, and that's, I think, maybe the go-to thought when you think of scale. But yeah, definitely about like organizing your code base, working with other people. There's definitely a lot of levels.
Yeah, and when you think of actually trafficking, or like the traffic of lots of traffic going to applications, website, on the front end, that's really not impacting us too much. Yes, you want to build performant code that scales, but that's a little bit different. It's not necessarily adding more traffic to the site or application.
And if it is traffic, it's in terms of the reach of users, like the breadth. So people can be on really low-end devices, people can be on very high-end devices. I think when we think about scale, we don't always think about our user base is like broadening. So they're not all going to be running Chrome. They're not all going to be on the fastest computer. So we have to take that in consideration when we build our apps.
Great. So when you're approaching your React app, kicking, brand new app or an old existing app, how do you approach it from thinking of scale in mind?
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
You don't have an answer for this?
I think naively we go in, we create apps, and we think, oh yeah, I'll just build this structure because it makes sense to me. But
cheers. Ben was even slow on that one.
But we don't think how it scales to 5 developers or 100 developers or 1,000. And we use weird paradigms like, oh, Derrick and Stacy, they know exactly what I did because I used some weird convention. But the other 500 people that need to start don't. And we don't think about that when we start our apps. So I like to start and think, like, what's the simplest, most intuitive structure that I can think of? It'll be a long day. One that would make sense intuitively to most engineers. I think that's a good foundation for starting an app.
I mean, I think thinking upfront about the patterns that you want to use and I'm trying to avoid the word structure of your folders.
Cheers.
Trying to avoid the word.
So like for scaling, if you start to have a ton of components and a lot of different files, if you have a folder structure that's like highly nested or something like that.
Cheers.
Sorry, so sorry. I can't, I'm just kidding. It can get very hard to manage and become very problematic later on, and it gets more difficult to develop. So some of those things, I think, are things that you have to think about kind of upfront.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I'd add too is I think it's okay to make changes as you go to and as you scale. I think sometimes, at least in my experience, you start one way and you're like, okay, this is the way that is the most scalable when you start, and then a couple of months down the road doesn't end up being very scalable, but you're like, we're kind of already down this path, but it's better to change direction then than to,
Over-engineer.
yeah.
I think that's hard. One of the hardest things I can say as an engineer was I was wrong. I think a lot of people are in that camp, whether they admit it or not. And it's hard to get 6 months in and realize, oh, the architecture that I built isn't right and it doesn't make sense anymore. And very few people do. We just keep going. We refactor, we pay that debt. But a really good engineer will be like, hey, there's actually something new and my bad, and I'm going to help fix it, but here's what's going on. You just don't see that often.
Well, because it's hard. You're probably being pushed by managers, product managers, whatever it is that you're working with to build features, and there's usually not the time to do that, but you end up paying the cost down the road, so it's like whatever you can find the time to do that. I think that's always important. I think you both, or a few of you touched on this point too, is adding new people to the team. I always think that is like the one time where I'm like really wanting to make sure that the code base is in a good spot so that it's easy for someone to ramp up on it. And that's not always easy if you are using weird paradigms that some crazy architecture that, yeah, Stacy and Jem wrote that I have no idea. I have to learn that. But if it's using some library that's already pretty familiar out there, it's well documented, using something like Redux or Flux, it's like something like that being in your code base, maybe they've already used that or experienced that, and that can be very useful.
Yeah, like don't reinvent the wheel. Like don't write Redux, your own flavor of it from scratch. Like maybe just use that because it's got more mind share and it's easier and more supportable and all the words.
Exactly. You don't even have to write the documentation. It's already done for you.
I've seen some, this is early days of React. I couldn't even tell you what version, but it was 3-4 years ago. And the developer who I was working with had made like deep hooks into, the part of React code where it's like, don't touch this, it's a private API. Did that anyways, because it's like, oh, and he built out like this entire application based on some core Redux or React functions. And then of course the API changed and we were screwed because we couldn't upgrade because it was just too costly to like refactor all this code. So again, this person like wasn't thinking ahead about scaling across 4, 5, 10 engineers. They made a choice because it was easy in the beginning, but now they're still paying that cost.
I love it too. It's not even just like other engineers jumping in. It's also versions. Like now they've kind of reached into something that may not even exist anymore, so that can be problematic too.
And I guess what I was trying to get at too is the sooner you can make that decision and realize that maybe you went the wrong direction, the better. I mean, maybe after 2 years down the path of one direction, it is a lot harder and a lot more expensive, and there's a lot more people invested in it than just you. But even if it's like a couple of weeks, I think it could be still as hard. It's still as hard, right? Because it's still like maybe you spent months fighting for this one direction, but now you realize that it's not the right direction.
So we've already started touching on these, but what are some challenges that you've seen? I mean, Jem, you just mentioned one pretty big challenge, but what are some challenges that you've seen going into a code base, or just even in your own structure? Cheers. Where you've regretted it or looked back and said, oh wait, I should have fixed that or thought about that ahead of time?
This is a really controversial thing I always say, but everybody should comment their code more. And I know there's people right now thinking, oh, my code's self-documenting because I write excellent code. You don't. I've come into code bases where the people were, it's a like really small startup, it was a tight knit, they all understood each other, and then I come in saying like, what's going on? None of this is documented. Oh, that's okay, because like it's this and this and this. I'm like, okay. But of course, explaining to one person how your code base works does not scale. So if you don't document your code, you're in for a bad time. And that's something I've run into a lot at many different companies. Just people assume one paradigm and they assume everybody used that same paradigm. That's not true. Even in React, which is fairly straightforward, people use different paradigms that may or may not make sense.
So I'll test. Jem does actually write really good comments in his code, like really good. So it helps.
One thing, I guess, kind of recently is testing, and we try to be as good at testing as possible. But recently was working on an app that was just a prototype, and I think sometimes you fall victim and you're in this like prototype stage. You're not going to write as many or any maybe acceptance tests or whatever. But then there's that prototype often will become not a prototype anymore, and then you're stuck, and then it's really hard to get back into that. So I think that's really important to do from the beginning.
So you think like writing unit tests, everything should be done from the get-go?
Yeah, I think that makes it a lot easier. I mean, there's always exceptions. I know things get crazy in the day-to-day, but I think whenever you can try to do that, that's the best.
I think on those lines, I mean, it's not specific to React, but if you have good linting, put all the automation you can in there so that when you scale the people on your team, you don't have to have like silly arguments over style.
That's a really good point.
And stuff. So like put prettier in there, or have style lint and all the linting you can have, just to avoid those conversations over and over and over.
Let the CLI yell at the people. You don't have to yell at them.
I'll say plus one to prettier. This was maybe last month at Netflix. Someone said, hey, we should standardize our file naming conventions. Which, of course, yeah, it makes sense. You want them all to be the same. No, there's a big debate over camel case versus snake case versus, I don't even know the other case. But it is easier when you use a tool and you just say, like, hey, we're going to use prettier, we're going to use this format, and it just does it for you. That just cuts out a lot of just extraneous conversations.
Awesome. So I want to touch on the unit-based, like unit tests and everything, especially in React. Are we writing unit tests for the components? Are you thinking more for helper functions, or is it like both? When you're writing your components early on, how are you thinking about that? For all of you, but I know Derrick mentioned unit tests.
Yeah, but I haven't written a lot of React, so.
Well, there you go. Jem, you're a big unit test guy. What do you think?
I write unit tests for server-side things, like because they're self-encapsulated functions that they should do one thing and one thing only. And so it's easy to unit test. For components, I break it down to the base component, and then I use Enzyme for component-based testing. And that usually gets us most of the way, and then we have end-to-end tests that kind of cover the whole suite.
Yeah, or if you want to just like very low bar to entry snapshot tests with Jess, like if you don't want to put a ton of effort into it, there's at least some level of verification.
Great. Yeah. So also, what approaches have you found helpful, I'm going to say it, structuring your React apps? Cheers.
Thank you for warning me.
Yeah, heads up there.
This is a hard one. Knowing when to componentize something is a really hard debate. Like, just hands up if you've seen a talk about UI components at any conference.
Every conference.
Yeah, everybody has. Everybody's seen a talk on how to build UI components, why they're good, we should be doing it. But no one really talks about when we should do it, because there's a cost to doing that, like extracting the CSS and the JS and everything else. There's a cost to doing that. So I think ahead of time it's good to set up rules to say, like, if this component is used, this functionality is used in, say, 3 places, we should probably pull it to its own component. And if you have a firm rule like that, then you don't end up with, like, component explosion, which I've also seen too. I mean, it's not a good example because it's Facebook, but I think they said somewhere they have like 40,000 components or something like that, which, I mean, it's Facebook, but still, I don't want to be in that, oh, I have a button. No, we have a component for red button. Don't worry about that. Like, that's too far. So I think thinking about that and thinking about scaling across multiple engineers is something that when I first go into the application, that's what I'm thinking about.
I like that you said rules around that too, because I have been in code bases where it's like componentize everything, and it gets really, really hard to understand what's even going on at that point. You're digging in files on files and files, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like you said, one red button, and you're like, okay, well, could that just be a button in general and have multiple colors or shapes and everything, and control that? But so I like that you said that too, is like there is a point where it's too much componentized. What else is good for helping with that building? I mean, for me too, one thing I always struggle with, I'm interested to your thoughts too, is when do you start using something like Redux? Like, especially in your React application, I find I kick myself down the road later. I should have just used it. But I start out, I'm like, I only have a couple components here. I don't really need to introduce Redux. And then I'm like, yeah. Then it comes a couple more components, and then this component needs to talk to this component. And I'm like, okay, I should have added Redux. But I'm interested to know each of your thoughts on when to use something like Redux.
I have an interesting experience because when I started to use React, it wasn't just using React. It was a massive stack of things. I came into something that like they'd already picked a huge amount of that architecture. So I came in where Redux was already in place, and so that was something that I had to use. And so it made sense to me because the thing that I was working on had, a lot of components on a page that did have to share state. Like I work on Bitbucket. If you need to merge a PR, you have a button where you click merge, and does some sort of asynchronous thing, and then the result that comes back, another component on the screen needs to do something based on that and to show like successful merge, or maybe show an error dialog or something like that. And so like that immediately seemed to me very. It seemed like a nice implementation for the complicated app that I was using and building. But I think, obviously, if you're not building something so complicated, maybe you only have like 3 components. Like at that point, like, do you bring in Redux? How do you know if it's going to get more complicated? And maybe it won't. And maybe that's overhead. I mean, I personally found Redux to be a bit hard to get my head around. It actually was, I think, the hardest thing of learning that entire stack, because there's a lot of boilerplate and a lot of code happening in lots of different places to get something that seemed kind of simple to happen. So I think there's a learning cost to adding Redux to your code base.
On my team, I was the holdout against Redux. But in all things, I prefer simplicity above anything else. Like, just keep it simple. And I argued that we didn't need Redux at the time and I was wrong, because our app grew and the complexity grew. But at the time, I was saying we don't need Redux. I think a lot of times engineers, we embrace complexity because we build this giant tower of things, and then someone comes up like, hey, how did you build that? You're like, dummy. Like, here's the docs. And then like you make people just feel not as intelligent because you chose to build this complicated thing. So people they say like, oh yeah, I want to get started in React. How do you do it? Well, you just need to Webpack, and then let's throw in less. Maybe some emotion, just
flow.
Because. Let's throw in some flow, or even TypeScript. How about both? Why not both at the same time? So you need Jest.
I like TypeScript, so you like Flow. Let's try both.
Yeah, let's throw in Redux, and if we're using Redux, let's use immutable JS because that's important.
Reselect.
Like, oh yeah, reselect. Jeez. So like
normalizer, denormalizer.
Keep going.
Keep going.
No, but like we don't think about like the complexity we're adding. Like even immutable JS, like that's a new paradigm for most JavaScript engineers. But just everybody jumps in because someone smart once said like you should use immutable without understanding why. And that is the conversation anytime someone adds a new library. I say, explain it to me why exactly I need this and I can't do this normally. And if they can't explain it, then don't add it in. And that's always been my like bar for adding new libraries or state management or anything like that.
Well, I actually appreciated Jem in this conversation because I was actually one of the big believers in adding Redux in our code base. We adopted React at Netflix really, really early on. And man, we had different like Flux implementations and non-Flux and just so many crazy like paradigms that were going on because we were building it as the ecosystem of React was changing. And so there was like some pages built one way, some the other. And as we were building like more of a single page application, it actually made a lot of sense to leverage something like Redux. And we'd almost kind of went, what Stacy was saying is like we almost created our own version at one point. And it really, really made sense to use something like Redux. And I remember debating this with Jem very much. And like we walked through different things. And like now it sounds like you're a lot more open to it, which is good to hear.
One of the interesting things with Redux and scaling is early on the decision was to make everything goes in Redux, like all state, no matter what, no matter how small. So even if you have like a UI state where a twisty, an expanded state, and a collapsed state, and even that went into Redux. And the idea was like, well, then it's this absolute source of truth. You can play forwards and backwards. You can reproduce issues, all that kind of thing, and then. Different engineer gets hired, has a different opinion about that, and they say, well, I don't think that should be there because that's too, what else needs to know about that? Nothing else needs to know about it. It's not really shared state. Take that out. So now you have this mixed bag of things. And so a scaling issue with that is kind of fascinating. Is recently we were talking about error handling and like unhandled exceptions or throwing things up to some sort of tool that's capturing all your exceptions in your app. Well, if you don't have everything in one place, you are not able to necessarily send a current state snapshot to an exception handler to send that back up. So now you're troubleshooting, you can't use the play forward, backwards feature of Redux anymore because it's not all there anymore. So it gets a little bit more difficult to debug something if you have a support issue come through. So I thought that was an interesting twist at the end of that.
I like that too, is even just you've separated the concerns at that point too. That's something that we've done a lot where we've even, I mean, you can go far as like saying, I mean, Netflix loves microsystems. Well, guess what? We do. And even just like separating some of the business logic and having it centralized. The team that Jem and I work on, we're building cross-platform. So even something like that, if you can build like really dumb UI components that aren't carrying a lot of business logic, yeah, you can do a lot where you're passing error states. You can really just manage a lot of things, and you don't have to write the business logic multiple times in the UI as well. And so that's been very useful.
It's interesting. The one thing I wanted to just point out is you mentioned about like Ryan, about the app being hard and being in different states across different teams. And at LinkedIn, we are now fully on board and have been for the past couple of years with Ember. And so one of the reasons we chose Ember is because it allowed us to solve that problem. But I think the point of this is that one thing that I think React really excels at, and Ember is now trying to do with Glimmer, is it scales both ways. So there are obviously a lot of use cases where you want to scale the opposite direction and not have Redux or whatever, like not have the whole package and just be able to have a small part of it. So.
Like Glimmer is actually separating those concerns.
Yeah, Glimmer is like essentially the view layer of Ember that they're trying to separate out.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, definitely the frameworks and getting into like Angular, React, Ember. It's like we're starting to see more of that, like similarities that are coming about. Like we're learning from each other, which is great.
And speaking of all the frameworks, like I have no beef with Ember. I mean, I give Derrick a hard time.
Just me?
Just you all the time. But who was it at, we were speaking at 4JS, and Alan Waxbert. Was it?
Alan Wicks?
Alan Brock, I remember his last name.
Alan.
Alan Werfsbrock, so he's on TC39. He's kind of like OG JavaScript. He was saying that it's dumb that like people get in such heated debates about which one's better, Ember or React or Angular or Vue. And he's like, what's funny is the people that created these libraries aren't involved in these debates, because they're all good solutions. But it's all the people that use them that are like, no, you're wrong. This is better than this. Ember's dumb, Angular's dumb, React is the one true way. And like we're having this massive argument, but it really doesn't matter. It's just, if you're aligned as a team, use whatever you want. Like I love React, it's awesome, but I'm not so opinionated that if I went to a new company and they're using Ember, I'd be like, okay, that's cool. As long as we're consistent.
Come on.
Maybe not Ember, but.
Yeah, we got to bug Derrick. So what advice would you give people if they're starting a new application, or just something to take away that we can help improve, like writing React for scale? Having better structure. Cheers.
The advice is the same as the advice we've been giving out on Front-End Happy Hour for years now. Learn JavaScript. I say that because I interviewed someone just the other day, and they couldn't explain like event delegation and event bubbling to me because they just use React and that it does it all for them. And I worry there's just this new class of engineer coming into front-end land, and they don't understand what's happening under the hood. So if build an application in JavaScript, and then as you need it, port in React, because that's what React's really good at, just use it when you need it. And then from there, like build out your application if it's your first app. And then you understand exactly what React is good for and what it's not so good for. And from there, you become like a really solid engineer. But if you just jump in with create React app, you'll be spending days configuring Webpack, which I've spent doing, or Redux, or it doesn't, all those tools that are kind of superfluous to your end goal of just building a UI.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think, I've interviewed people in the same vein of like whether it be Angular or React, and that's what they know. And I've written so many different frameworks over the years that I'm like, yeah, I'm still just writing JavaScript, which is great. But yeah, like React might not be the thing anymore. It's like we could totally ditch it a few years from now, and then it's like we have to learn something new anyways. So you don't want to be too holden to the framework.
I think if you're just getting started and maybe you are new to React, but you want to make sure you're setting yourself up for scale, would be to, I guess, just read a lot of blog posts. There's lots of people that have a lot of opinions about structure and cheers.
Cheers.
And the way that things should, what patterns to use, and just use some of that to start with. Maybe come up with your own if you start to feel like those things don't meet your needs, but don't, I guess, try and start off creating your own pattern. Like you'll get there eventually, but you use the mind share of stand on the shoulders of giants.
I like that.
Yeah, I think in general too, I mean, it's good to read as much as you can and make sure that you're able to make the most informed decision that you can. But obviously there's a point where you just need to jump in, and you also, going back to what I was saying earlier, and you just need to be okay with admitting that you were wrong, if it comes to that. So, but.
I have a hard question for the panel. When do you use React Native if we're talking about scale?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, you can write for 2 applications at once, which is a benefit. There's definitely trade-offs. Like even for one thing that always worried me when we've kind of explored that at Netflix is in the Angular, or sorry, in I don't know why I said Angular, but whatever. In Android, you're adding actually a lot of weight to the actual app size, roughly 2 to 3 megs just by adding React Native to it. And that can be concerning. Like you're thinking about, especially in some of the, like Netflix being global, I'm thinking about, okay, someone in India downloading this, they may not have the fastest connectivity. And so now that's adding to the download size. Yes, it's pretty small, but we haven't built anything. We just added a library. So that can be concerning. I think there's also things as Apple and Google release new features, new OS. Well, now you're also having to wait for React Native to catch up with those new features and APIs so that you can take advantage of it. There is benefits to it though as well, that you're not just writing React Native, you could also be writing Objective-C, Swift, Kotlin, Java on the Android side. You're not just writing React, so you can kind of get around that as well, but definitely interested in everyone else's thoughts.
Yeah, I think if it's very animation graphic heavy, I mean every time you have to jump across the bridge or whatever they call it, it can. And I think sometimes if you write React, maybe you don't always understand what's happening under the hood on the native side and vice versa. So I think if you do understand it, then I think maybe you can probably write a pretty performant React Native app. But the thing I always thought was really interesting about React Native, and this wouldn't help with the binary size, but what I think is a really good use case and what Facebook does a lot is to use it in the place of what you would typically use a web view for. So like a lot of times a web view is just something that, at least on a native app, you just want to throw up something quick for all your platforms. So for instance, at LinkedIn, we do it for all of our settings because it's just kind of a chore to update settings across all 3 platforms that we support. So I think React Native is a really good use case for that. And I know like Facebook uses it for like their advertising manager and I think even for their events page or their events portion of their flagship app. So I think that's a really good use case because then you still get the native experience and it's not as bad as having to load and deal with some of the performance issues of loading a web view.
So will you ever change to a web view? Or from a web view to React Native?
I mean, yeah, I would love to. Parts of the app that have web views now, I think they should definitely be. That would be awesome to do React Native.
I like that use case.
I think some of it is a people scale problem too. Like, if you have like a small number of people and they all know JavaScript, then it probably makes sense to use something where they could write it once and run it multiple places, as opposed to like you're a bigger company, maybe you have more money, you can have like teams building out the native thing, like your Android team, your iOS team. So it was always a scale thing. Like I had done some Cordova hybrid apps a few years back, and it really was about money and business decision. Like we don't have the money to like spin up all these teams to do these different stacks.
I like that. And you could even, there are ways to even tie some of the web code into your React Native. But even going back to Redux, you could leverage Redux to really manage a lot of the logic up top and really just build out components for the UI. Yes, iOS and Android are written a little bit different than the web, But you could actually leverage something like Redux across those 3 platforms, so there could be value there as well for scaling. And to your point, is also scaling for multiple engineers.
And on the Redux, not to jump back to it, I still argue that if someone's saying, hey, we want to add Redux to our platform, they should give me a convincing reason why, because it still adds this layer of complexity that I think a lot of people don't necessarily need until you're at scale. But they just throw it in there, and then we have a private Slack group for just like front-end people. And I see a lot of questions about Redux, and people are like, just basic questions, because they're using it for things that like just don't need Redux. So if you don't understand why, then don't use it. And I should make that on a t-shirt. Would you buy it? Anybody? No? Okay. One person, that's enough for me.
Great. Well, I think we're running just on time here. We have 5 minutes. I would love to, where can people get in touch with you? I'd love to hear, if people want to get in touch with you, Jem, where can they find you?
If it's a friendly email, you can hit me up at jem@netflix.com. If you're just angry, you can just send me a tweet at Jem Young, I prefer dog pictures. Just throwing that out there.
I'm Stacy Londoner on Twitter.
I'm Derrick Showers on Twitter.
I'm at Burgess D. Ryan on Twitter. I like the dog pictures, but you can also send me some tattoo photos if you have tattoos. Jem will send you stickers, so I'll do the same if I get some photos. So that will be a good way to
bribes are coming out.
Yeah, bribes are coming out. Well, thank you all for listening. If you're wanting to listen to us, check out frontendhappyhour.com. We're on Twitter as well at frontendhh. Follow, subscribe to us on whatever podcast catcher that you like to listen to. And I want to thank Reactathon for having us out here. We really enjoyed being out here. It's been a great conference, so thank you so much, and thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.